Welcome to the Rotary Club of Milwaukee. I am Club President Darren Miller, President and owner of JM Construction. As we gather virtually today, we will begin our program with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today, I'd like to welcome Maya Yurcik, President and Director for National Accounts with Concentra, who will give our invocation today. Maya?
Thanks, Darren. Dear fellow Rotarians and guests, it was serendipity that I was assigned the invocation for today. I started Georgetown School of Foreign Service in 1972, the same year that John Thompson started as coach of Georgetown's basketball team. And with this invocation, I wanted to create a brief space for us to reflect on what his career and life can teach us today. Just as Coach Thompson did not want his biography to be a book about basketball, he didn't think his job was simply teaching his players how to win basketball games. He used basketball as an instrument to teach his players about life and how best to live it. So during this pause in our busy day, let us reflect on two of Coach Thompson's lessons to his players and take them to heart. Value your intellectual attributes and diligently exercise your minds so that you have the capacity to think and excel in various situations. Show the courage to challenge injustice. Do not accept the unacceptable. Lastly, when John Thompson arrived at Georgetown, he felt that as a coach, he had to win because Black people did not have the right to be unsuccessful. However, he believed, as did Mahatma Gandhi, that true freedom includes the freedom to make mistakes. So in both our personal and professional lives, let us extend that freedom to those around us. Amen.
Thank you, Maya. Appreciate you doing that for us today. Next, we have well, first of all, I'd like to welcome our guests from Marquette University and from Georgetown University's Alumni Club. Thank you for being with us today. Next, we have a new member to introduce today. Bill Coleman, president of Coleman & Williams, will introduce new member Patty Hayback. Bill?
Thank you, President Darren. Today, I introduce Patty Hayback, who is currently the president and CEO of Feeding America. And I'm sure a lot of us know about the history of Feeding America and how far back we go with Feeding America. I first met Patty when we hired her. I was on the board of Feeding America at that time to help raise money to build our warehouse in northern Wisconsin. And she did a fantastic job at the time in helping us raise the money. And we raised the money in record time. And we actually undertook construction of the building much sooner than we had planned. And before I left the board, I had tried to recruit her to become a Rotarian, at which time I believe she was part of the Appleton Club. So when she decided to join our club, I was very, very gratified. So members of Rotary, I bring before you Patty Hayback. Patty, welcome to Rotary.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Welcome, Patty. Really looking forward to being able to connect with you in person soon. I'd also like to say thank you to our rotating sponsors who help support the work of our club. The logos run prior to some of our programs and also on our website. Today, we'd like to highlight the Burke Company, Cushman & Wakefield. For over 90 years, the Burke Company has been a leader in Southeast Wisconsin's commercial real estate market. Their exclusive alliance with Cushman & Wakefield began in 2006 and has given them tremendous opportunities to serve national and global businesses, which are both moving into or expanding beyond Southeastern Wisconsin. They have also supported our annual RCM Scholarship Golf Classic. So special thank you to the Burke Company, Cushman & Wakefield, for your continued support. Our Thursday snack program this week will feature a signature international project of our club. RCM, in conjunction with Engineers Without Borders, assist students, engineers at Milwaukee universities in building life-changing bridges in rural Guatemala. Learn how these bridges are designed and constructed from 2 Marquette University student engineers in a Civil Engineering 101 program, moderated by Rotarian Mark Federley. Please note this program is scheduled to run for about an hour. Join our fellow Rotarians at 11:30 for informal conversation prior to the program starting at noon. Many of you have also begun to ask, when will we start meeting again in person? As you know, the health and safety of our members has been a top priority for RCM since the pandemic began. We pay close attention to the latest guidelines and recommendations about COVID-19 from the CDC and the health department here in Milwaukee. We are told that with the vaccine now becoming more widely available, it's possible to start beginning to get together in person. Our member opinions always shape the decisions we make here at Rotary. When we ask our members, when would you feel safe coming back to in-person meetings? We learn that more and more people are ready to come back. The latest guidelines, combined with feedback from members, make us feel comfortable in planning a return to in-person meetings on May 4th. And yes, of course, we will continue to have a live stream option for those who prefer to participate from home or office. We'll keep you posted as plans firm up, and we will also be asking members to RSVP in the early weeks of our return. In the meantime, stay safe, get a vaccine as soon as you can, and we can't wait to see you in person. And now, Richie Burke, president of GGMM and founder of the GoGedders podcast, will begin our program and introduce our featured guest today. Richie?
Thank you, Darren. You guys are all stuck with me for, I believe, the second time in 3 weeks, but the good news is we have an amazing guest for you today. Jesse Washington. He is a 1992 Yale grad. He played on the basketball team there and also worked for Business Week in the New York Times in the late 90s. He was the managing editor at Vibe and the founder-in-chief at Blaze, both hip-hop magazines. He co-founded the streetball magazine Bounce in the early 2000s. He's the author of the novel titled Black Will Shoot. He's now with ESPN and The Undefeated. Jesse, I did follow you on Instagram yesterday. I don't mean to inflate your ego too much, but I do want to let everyone know at age 51, you can still dunk a basketball.
That's the most important part of my bio. Thank you.
It is. It looks very effortless too. So any advice on aging gracefully that you want to sprinkle into this talk, feel free to do so. You looked good out there. And why we're bringing you on today, he is the co-author of John Thompson's autobiography. I came as a shadow of John Thompson, the trailblazing head coach of Georgetown that took over the program in '72 when he inherited a 3-23 basketball team. He got the program to the NCAA tournament 3 years later, won the title in 1984, becoming the first Black head coach to do so, although he does not like when people label him as that. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1999 and arguably did more for race relations and the advancement of Black people than any other coach in the history of the game, which we'll be diving into. I have the book right here. I read the whole thing. It's amazing. So we'll link it in the comments, but I do recommend that everyone goes and reads that. It was, very, very entertaining. John Thompson was a little before my time. I went to Marquette and remember his son coaching the team while I was there, but yeah, it was very cool, and congrats. It was great work on that book. And thanks for joining us today.
Oh man, great to be here. That's a very generous introduction. And Maya, I thought the way you highlighted the important parts of Coach's book was tremendous. So thank you for having me, everybody.
Absolutely. So you just look at the back cover of this book and you see blurbs from Iverson, Bill Clinton, Michael Jordan, Phil Knight, Patrick Ewing, Lil Bond, Coach K. I'm sure there could have been plenty more if there was more real estate on that back cover, but could you just touch briefly on how you got this gig? It's pretty remarkable. You did a fantastic job, but I'm sure it wasn't easy getting this, or there was a lot of competition. I'm curious how you got it.
Well, the first thing is that Coach decided to tell his story, and I believe that his children were instrumental in convincing him to do that. And then he needed a writer. So his children and his literary agent were looking for somebody, and my name got thrown into the hat. I had to interview. It was a tough interview. And even after he said I could write his book, I was still on probation for a good 3 or 4 months. I had to prove myself, and he wanted to see, how the writing would come out. But also, I think I really got the gig and earned his trust when I showed that I wanted to work hard. And I didn't just show up and turn on a tape recorder and say, "What do you want to talk about, Coach?" I came with questions. I came with research. I came prepared. And as a basketball coach, I think he appreciated somebody who was willing to work hard to help him reach his goal.
Yeah, and the book goes in chronological order for the most part. Can you touch on John Thompson's upbringing in the DC area in the 40s and 50s, and how that really shaped the kind of person that he ultimately became?
Absolutely. It was segregated in DC in the 40s and 50s. And also his father was from rural Maryland, 55 miles outside of DC. And that was a Jim Crow state, with Jim Crow still in effect when Coach Thompson was growing up. And so the first place that he encountered segregation was at the Catholic Church in St. Mary's County, Maryland, where he and his family had to sit in the back and they had to take communion second. And those were some of his experiences. He said he never saw any white people whatsoever in his neighborhood at all. And he first really encountered white people on a meaningful level as teachers in elementary school. And then they made him leave because they thought that he was, and the unfortunate word that they used at that time was retarded, because in the 5th grade, John Thompson, one of the most brilliant people we've seen in America, could not read. And so this was a very formative experience for him because he knew that they thought he was stupid. And then he went to a public school where a Black teacher said, "Oh, you're not dumb, you just need help." And she gave him the help, and he went on to live the life that he lived. So Coach is very specific in his book. He says, it's not that there were no white teachers that could have helped me. There are probably plenty of white teachers who would have helped me learn how to read. But the way it turned out for me, it was a Black woman who really saw the potential in me. And that was sort of a foundational moment for his life and his coaching, able to look past the appearances of a kid and find an intelligence and a potential that others might overlook. So those are some things about his childhood.
Yeah, and we'll get into Proposition 22 later when he boycotted that, but it really comes full circle in his coaching career. And I just want to talk about, you mentioned the first time he encountered racism was at the church, and he wasn't around a lot of white people. And I think it unfortunately speaks to, the psyche of Black Americans, especially growing up at that time, and maybe even somewhat today. A quote from the book was, "Everyone acted like Black sitting in the back was the way things were supposed to be. We were mentally conditioned." I didn't get angry in the back of the church and want to throw a brick through the stained glass window. Later, I got mad that I didn't get mad about it. I got mad that I wasn't aware of it, because that's the biggest danger. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Thank you for highlighting that passage, because it really speaks to the layers and the complexities of Coach Thompson's thought process. And one of his defining characteristics was the ability to see deeply, to see things in situations that others might miss. And so he emphasized over and over as we were writing in the book, and I hope it came through, that I'm not complaining about the fact that it was segregated. I wasn't deprived. This isn't a sob story. But what I'm really upset about is that we accepted it, that we acted like it was no big deal. Another defining aspect of his childhood was that Coach Thompson's father, who grew up there in rural Maryland, could not read or write. He had to leave school probably in the elementary school age and go and work in the fields. And he said, we just acted like it was a normal thing for a person as intelligent as my dad to not be able to spell his own name. And think about how that places mental limits on you. He loved this story, and it's in the book, and I'll paraphrase it. He said there was a dog on a chain, and every day people would walk by the dog, and the dog would bark and growl and yell and act like he wanted to bite someone. And he would chase them, and then the chain would pull the dog up short. One day they took the chain off the dog, and the dog ran after somebody to bite him and stopped where the chain used to be. And to Coach Thompson, that really illustrated a lot of the ways that Black folks limit ourselves because of what we've seen and how we've been conditioned.
Yeah, and Jesse, you mentioned his dad. That's what he wasn't allowed to get an education. But his mom, on the other hand, she was educated, right, but ended up cleaning homes of white people instead of being a teacher, which is what she should have been doing, right?
Absolutely. She had a college degree in teaching, but she cleaned homes in order to support the family because she could not get work as a teacher.
Yeah. And then, so John Thompson, he grows up in that environment. He goes to school at Providence. He ends up having success there as a player. They won the NIT, right? I believe.
Yep, that was a national championship in the 60s. That was the equivalent of a national championship. He was All-American. He averaged 26 and 15, which I was surprised to learn.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't know that. And even I was talking to my dad as I was reading the book a few weeks ago, and he wasn't aware that he went on to play for the Celtics and win 2 titles in his first 2 years there for Red Auerbach. And he won those 2 titles playing behind Bill Russell. A lot of people don't know that, but then he left the NBA after 2 years. Can you touch on that and what he did next, which is unheard of in this day and age? Someone, rookie winning 2 titles and then leaving the NBA.
Absolutely. It was very anomalous for Coach Thompson to say, hey, I don't need basketball anymore. He had always intended to be a teacher and work with young people because of the examples he had coming up, starting with his mother and a lot of mentors that he had, youth counselors. So that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to help young people. And the pay wasn't great for the NBA. And he said, I don't need basketball anymore. They left him open in the expansion draft. So he would have had to go to a new city and things like that. He said, forget that. I'm gonna go back home to Washington, D.C. and work with young people. And he intended to never be involved with basketball at all after that. So he worked as a counselor with troubled youth, with young girls. He said that he would be out in the park, camping out overnight, singing Girl Scout songs. So not quite the image that we have of Coach Thompson stalking the sidelines. That was his life after he left professional basketball.
Yeah, and I was listening to a different podcast you did, and you I think someone may have asked you to compare him to an animal or something like that. You said a mama grizzly bear or something.
Absolutely.
It's not the image you get from like the 6'10", 260-pound outspoken coach on the sideline.
He was a mama's boy. It was amazing for me to find out. I was very surprised, but numerous of the most important influences in his life were Black women, specifically his mother and several teachers that he had. And they taught him about dealing with people, empathy, protection, and all the stuff that we saw later with Coach Thompson, which turned a lot of people off and he absorbed a lot of criticism for, really came from his instinct to protect his players at all costs and to make sure that they graduated at all costs. He had a maternal instinct that he got from his mom. The towel over his shoulder was really something that his mother did, and he took that from her. So, these are some of the things that I found out about, along with everyone else, when I was working on the book.
Interesting. So he's the guidance counselor. He's the head coach at St. Anthony's High School in DC, and then he gets hired for the Georgetown job, which was unheard of at that point in time. Georgetown, very elite, very white school, and they're hiring this big outspoken Black coach. Obviously, it wasn't a very good program. They were 3-23 when he took it over. Can you touch more on how he got that job and the mentality that he had going in there?
Well, it's pretty amazing that they did hire him in 1972, because when he graduated from high school 12 years earlier in 1960 as one of the most highly recruited players in the country, really, Georgetown didn't recruit him because they didn't have Black players on their team. And then 12 years later, they hired him to be the coach. But what happened was Georgetown looked around, and to their credit, they said, we have to do better. We live in a Black city. We operate on their tax dollars. The city is rioting because of injustices, and we don't have any Black people here at our university. And they also wanted to have a good basketball team. And I interviewed the dean of admissions then and now, Charlie Deacon, who was a basketball fan, and he was out and about in DC. Coach Thompson had an extremely successful program in Washington, and Charlie Deacon knew 2 things. He knew that if Coach Thompson came to Georgetown, he would bring Black players with him. And he knew that that Georgetown needed to open itself up more to Black Washington, DC. And so that's why Coach Thompson was hired, they didn't know what they were getting. They didn't know he would be one of the all-time greats. They didn't know he was so outspoken. They didn't know all the qualities they were getting. But Coach Thompson is very appreciative of the fact that once they found out, oh, this is the kind of guy you hired, they never tried to change him. They never told him, you can't be John Thompson.
Yeah, and it seemed like he went in with the mentality too that he had to win, even though they were 3-23. As a black coach, he knew he kind of had a short leash. He could get fired if he didn't do well. He wasn't going to get a lot of second chances, and he really had to go in there and win, not only for himself, but probably to trailblaze other opportunities for black coaches and black people to get into positions of power.
That's a very important point, and I'm glad you raised it, and in his third season, they had a losing streak and his job was on the line, and then his team turned it around. And it was interesting because someone threw a racist banner through the window of the gym, and it was a big deal. It was in the newspapers. It was a horrible experience. His children and his wife saw it, and they had lost 6 games in a row to that point. And Coach Thompson said, I couldn't sleep at night because I had never lost 6 games in a row in my entire life. And at that point, the season turned around, and he knew that he carried this responsibility and this weight because unfortunately then, and even to a certain extent now, Black people are judged collectively by the actions of a few, or even in this case, by the actions of one. So Coach Thompson knew that if he's the trailblazing Black coach and Georgetown finally opens his doors to hire a Black person and he's not successful, then the thought will be, see, we're not going to make that mistake again. And no other Black people will get an opportunity. Fortunately, in that third season, they turned their season around. They made the NCAAs on a miracle shot, last second shot, I should say, not a miracle. And the rest became history.
Yeah, and even with all the good he was doing, I mean, he faced a certain perception of Hoya paranoia and being labeled as intimidating and all of that he had to overcome. There was bananas that were thrown on the court. You made a reference to Iverson, where I forget what school it was, but the student section had jumpsuits and said he was the next OJ, not MJ, and stuff like that. And he had to face and overcome a lot of that as a coach.
He did. And this is some of the most important sections of the book, grappling with this image that Georgetown received and was foisted upon it, and the reasons behind that image. I was on SportsCenter the other day talking about Patrick Ewing's great season at Georgetown, and they made the tournament, and everyone's so happy for Patrick. And I had to remind folks, everybody hated Georgetown. Now, who do I mean by everybody? And I received some angry emails and calls from viewers who resented the fact that I said on television, I basically related Coach Thompson's thoughts in his book. And I said, well, why was Georgetown so widely hated? It's because they were good. And a big part of it was because they were Black. And people did not like to see an all-Black team at an elite white institution playing extremely aggressively, not backing down, getting shoved, and there were shoving matches and fist fights. People did not like to see that. Now, Coach Thompson was very specific in his book, and I had to learn this working with him. I would write something, I would say, yeah, and white people said this. And he would always stop me and say, no, you can't say white people. You have to say some white people. So he was very cognizant that it was not all. But the fact that Georgetown was so Black and the way they played and they were so successful, people were scared of them and people didn't like them. And they developed this image around them. And the way Coach Thompson dealt with that and protected his players from that is a huge part of his legacy. The way he describes it in the book is, I think, really important because certain aspects of those assumptions still are in effect in society today. And one of the lessons that we can take from his book is the same way that Coach Thompson's team was stereotyped and really misrepresented, we still do that to a certain segment of America. Based on income, based on race. There's sexism involved with some things. So we really have to examine our own prejudices and biases and our unconscious thoughts that we don't want to admit, and really look at why we think and act certain ways towards other people.
Absolutely. And you mentioned him protecting his players, and he did have that kind of maternal instinct that you referred to earlier and felt a real responsibility. He looked at himself as a teacher before a basketball coach. He never thought he would be a basketball coach, and that really showed with his coaching style. Can you touch more on that? As practices, there was no media involved to protect the kids for the most part. He made sure they were up on current events. He was very clear that more money was made sitting down than standing up for most people. The list goes on. And yeah.
Yeah, well, so Coach Thompson said in the very beginning of the book, I always considered myself a teacher. My classroom was the court. And often he took that literally. And so several of his players would say, yeah, he'd blow the whistle and make us all sit down. And we would talk for an hour about things that had nothing to do with basketball. Michael Jackson, his championship point guard, said sometimes he would blow the whistle and he would scream at me for messing up a defense. Other times he would blow the whistle and ask one of my teammates, what happened in Iran today? And if you didn't have an answer, then you were in trouble. You know, he forced them to read the newspaper and to become aware and to think. That was his big thing. And one of the great parts of Maya's introduction to his book was that emphasis on succeeding with your mind. You know, it was so important to him. So his practices also were what another player described to me as a slight version of hell, in terms of having to run, getting cussed out. Coach Thompson's profanity was legendary. And one of the great contradictions that he sort of reveled in. And so a lot of his players said that they thought their name was MFer, like, because that's what he calls him all the time. But he also used it as a term of endearment. And the first time he used it in my direction, I felt like, you know, I had joined the team. So he was always teaching, though, in practice. And in addition to excelling on the court, his higher objective was to make sure that his players were educated, not went to class, not passed class, but were educated and could make some sort of contribution to the world with their minds. And he was a great believer and continued to emphasize over and over in his book the importance of informal education. What type of experiences are young people getting outside of the classroom? So when they went on a road trip for a basketball game, he would take them to a museum or a historical site, or go see the place where Martin Luther King was killed, or things like that. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but that really is a tremendous testament to who he was, and it's what makes him unique. This is what we remember Coach Thompson for, and winning. All the other great coaches, no disrespect to them, not taking anything away from them, but they're mostly remembered for winning. So he's remembered for that and more, and it's what makes him so special.
Yeah, and I know you could go on and on. I do want you to tell two stories. I think my two favorite stories from the book regarding him and coaching, and one's the beer and practice story, which was amazing. If you could just tell that, and then the other one I wanted to bring up was how he handled the whole Rayful Alonzo Mourning situation, which was also amazing. So if you want to start with the
absolutely
beer story,
so,
I was laughing through that one.
Yeah, Coach had a principle, and he said, you always have to keep these players off guard. You have to let them know that I'm capable of anything, and that you can't predict where I am or where I'm going to be or what I'm going to do. And he also knew everything that was going on because he befriended all of the custodial workers and parking lot attendants and people who took out the trash. He talked to them all the time and befriended them, and they let him know everything that was going on. Quick side story, Dikembe Mutombo said one time he snuck off campus to go to the club, and when he got to the club, the guy at the door said, Coach called and said you to get your butt back home. But at one point, his players were carousing a little bit too much, and he knew, college kids are going to drink beer, okay, but they were taking it too far. So the next day in practice, everyone on a basketball team has a water bottle with their number on it. And the guys who were drinking the beer, he put beer in their water bottles. And then when he blew the whistle and gave them a water break, he just sat there and looked at the guys who had been drinking too much beer, and they took a swig, and there was Heineken in the water bottles. Specifically, it told the assistant coach, what's the best beer out there? He said, Heineken. He said, go get me some. And so now this goes back to not letting people in practice. Coach was way ahead of his time in so many ways, and that's one of them. He was criticized to the utmost for keeping reporters out of practice and not letting them talk to the kids. But that's really how it has to be. You have to protect these kids from all this other demands on their time. And also, his practice is the classroom. You're not going to let a reporter into a classroom to see kids get questions wrong on the test. You think you could walk into Coach Krzyzewski's practice right now without a dispensation from him and anybody else? No, nor should you be able to. So he said, with reference to incidents like cursing people out in practice or putting beer in their water bottles, I wasn't keeping reporters out of practice to prevent them from doing their job. I was preserving my ability to do mine. So I thought that was tremendous. And then Rayful Edmonds. So this was one of the biggest challenges of Coach Thompson's career. And he came back from the Olympics and he had been sort of out of the mix. And Alonzo Mourning, who was the biggest recruit in the country, he was sort of like the Zion Williamson of his day, had been there in DC on campus all summer. And he and one of his teammates, who was from the neighborhood, started hanging out with a drug kingpin, not a drug dealer, a drug kingpin by the name of Rayful Edmonds. Rayful loved to play ball. They were playing on a summer league team. They would go hang out at his house and so on and so forth. And Alonzo was a naive kid from the country in Virginia and didn't really know what he was getting into. When Coach Thompson found out, he knew he had to put a stop to it. So first he called in Alonzo Mourning and scared the bejesus out of him. And for all of us who are familiar with Alonzo Mourning, I mean, it seems like nothing could scare this guy. He's the biggest, toughest, strongest, most vehement individual we've seen come through the NBA in a long time. But apparently after his meeting with Coach Thompson, he was in tears. That's how strong the conversation was from Coach. So that was half of the equation. Then Coach said, I had to speak to Rayful. So how does the coach of Georgetown's basketball team summon a drug kingpin to his office on Georgetown's campus and have a meeting with him in order to disassociate this kid from his program? And how does he make him do it? Now, Rayful Edmonds was a young Black man from DC. And really, I don't want to give away too much from the book, but the thing was that there was a mutual respect there. Rayful Edmonds respected John Thompson and everything he had done for people in DC. And he respected what he represented. And Coach Thompson respected Rayful, didn't condone him selling drugs or anything like that, but he said, I looked upon him as my neighbor's child. So if we're in our neighborhood and we've got a neighbor and they got kids who are getting off the track, we're going to try and get them on the right track. We're not going to condemn them forever. So it was a delicate balance that Coach had to walk when dealing with this drug dealer. Shortly after their meeting, he was arrested by federal authorities and charged with orchestrating murders and selling enormous quantities of cocaine. And Rayful Edmonds is locked up to this day. The fact that Coach Thompson was able to extricate himself from that situation and protect his kids is one of the most amazing stories in sports history, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, the guy was not just some local drug dealer. As you said, I mean, he had an operation all up and down the coast and got life in prison, and he invites him to practice. And I think in the book, you know, the players
made him come.
Shows up and he has a sit-down meeting face-to-face with this guy. But yeah, there was a mutual respect. You did mention him looking at Rayful as kind of a neighborhood child. And I think I want to segue that into Proposition 22, if you can touch on that and how he looked at that as just a big disadvantage for lower income Black kids, and how if that rule was in place when he was going into college, he never would have got the opportunity to play at Providence, that never would have gone to the Celtics, never would have became the head coach at Georgetown. And he just touched on that.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think a good place to start is that the NCAA passed a rule. And if that rule was in place when Coach Thompson was graduating from high school, he would have been prevented from getting an athletic scholarship. It would have cast him to the side and we would never know who John Thompson is. And clearly Coach Thompson had the intelligence to make it at Providence because he received a bachelor's degree in economics, a teaching certificate in social studies, and later got a master's degree in counseling and guidance. But he did not have a good SAT score. And so the NCAA passed a rule that said you can't get a scholarship if you don't have a 700 on the SATs. Now, there is a lot of controversy then and now about, 700 is such a low score. You know, what's the big deal? You're setting the bar too low. If you set the bar, then they'll, exceed it and things like that. But what Coach Thompson says is that it was a misuse of an educational instrument. And you're using a standardized test, but we do not have a standard system of education in this country. That at far too many schools, mostly populated by poor students, and Black people are disproportionately poor, you're not getting the equal education that a kid in a wealthy district is getting. And, he said something that I found very moving in pertains to informal education. He said, these kids in the poor schools are lucky to have enough textbooks, which is a fact to this day. And Coach Thompson said, my grandchildren, they skip off to Europe on a school trip like it's nothing. So these are all the ingredients that go into whether you succeed on the SAT or not, and whether you can get a 700. And he recognized that there are lots of kids who deserve help. And help is just another word for education. This is what Coach Thompson is saying. So in order to protest this rule, which the NCAA passed in secret, Coach Thompson boycotted 2 games. He walked off the court in the first one, and he very strategically let the media know what he was going to do. And they got the image as his team went out for the tip. He walked off the court and left the arena in order to draw attention to a discriminatory rule. And then this placed enough pressure on the NCAA that they rescinded the rule. I find it very interesting and an example of how Coach was ahead of his time, that now the best universities from around the nation, and I know this is a controversial topic and some of you may disagree with the fact that they are doing this, but they are understanding and no longer requiring SAT scores for admission. Look it up. A lot of universities are saying, you know what? This is not the best way to assess the future success of a student at our university. And so I think that traces back to the stance that he took, boycotting games over Proposition 42.
Yeah, it's amazing how his legacy is living on in so many different ways that people don't know about. And when he was protesting, he had a number of coaches lined up that were going to walk out with him, Black and white coaches, even back then. And I think he called them off and got the job done single-handedly.
He did. He wanted to maintain his leverage. He said the fear of the riot is more powerful than the riot itself.
Yes, he was, just a very smart guy in a lot of ways. And I mean, he still had conflict with the NCAA. Obviously, he was outspoken about it till the time he died. The last chapter of the book, he took a number of shots at the NCAA, pretty much to close out the book on players being paid and how he's kind of come around on that. Can you just touch on that briefly, why he felt the need to include that in his life story? And yeah.
Yes. Like everything with Coach Thompson, there's a lot of layers to it. So Coach Thompson's son, John, was fired at Georgetown after, I think, 12 years because he missed the tournament 2 years in a row. This after going to the Final Four. Mind you, before Tony Bennett went to the Final Four at Virginia 2 years ago, John Thompson Jr. and John Thompson III were the only father and son in college basketball history to both reach the Final Four. So they fired his son, and Coach Thompson was very mindful of the fact that Georgetown doesn't cheat. They don't pay for players. And the vast majority of other universities do, particularly all of those at the top of college basketball. No need to name any names, but if you just do your Googling, you will find that school after school is publicly exposed as paying for players. And for every school that's publicly exposed, there's 10 that we don't know about. So Coach Thompson, near the end of his life, saw, wow, you got these coaches who are on federal wiretaps talking about paying players, and they're still coaching. And my son is going to get fired because he's doing it right, and he can't beat the guys who cheat. And I'll tell you what, one of the people that is on those federal wiretaps, I watched their game last night, and the kid who got the money was getting buckets on television last night, LSU. So, and coach was like, this doesn't make any sense. So this is the way his mind works. He said, if the NCAA is not going to enforce its own rules about not paying players, you got to level the playing field and let everybody get paid. Aside from that, he felt that there was so much money being generated that the athletes do deserve a portion of that revenue. Now, he's very careful to say that a lot of people say that they have to get paid because the education isn't worth anything. And the education is one of the most valuable things they get, but they also deserve more. So he didn't want to discount the value of a college education. And he also didn't want to discount the fact that there's a lot of wrinkles in how you would work it out to actually pay kids. He said if we were paying kids when Iverson was at Georgetown, Iverson would have said that he deserved more money than the other guys on the team, and he would have been right. So, it was a huge step. To my knowledge, Coach Thompson is the only prominent coach who has said that players need to be paid. And I believe that will be yet another example of how he was ahead of his time.
Yeah. So John Thompson passed away on August 30th this past year. One quote in the book when he was looking back on his upbringing was, "Police meant run. We were trained from birth to think that police were our enemy, in some cases for a good reason." I'm wondering, did you get to talk to him much about George Floyd and the BLM movement? I'm guessing it was maybe slightly after the book wrapped up or was wrapping up. And what did he think of everything that was going on at that point in time?
We did get to talk about it, and he addresses it in the introduction to the book. And he was very proud of people protesting and standing up and saying this isn't acceptable. And you mentioned it in your intro, that we cannot accept the unacceptable. He did not like the riots whatsoever. And Coach Thompson was able to do something that I find to be one of the highest levels of sophistication and understanding, which was to navigate two apparently contradictory positions or thoughts at one time. So when it came to Colin Kaepernick, he supported Colin Kaepernick's demonstrations strongly. But Coach Thompson said, I would never kneel for the anthem, but I support his right to do so. Now, to me, that's a very nuanced and very deep understanding of how the situation really is and what we're dealing with. So he looked on the Black Lives Matter protests that way also. He didn't always agree with the methods that some of the young people took and the things that he saw, but the overall aim he understood was positive. It really goes back to how he dealt with protests from Jesse Jackson when Coach Thompson was Nike's highest paid coach, about to get on the board of directors. And Jesse Jackson launched a protest that said, don't buy Nikes because the company doesn't have enough Black people. Yeah. And so Coach said, Jesse and I were on opposite sides of that protest, but we both were working for the same goal, which was more empowerment for Black people. So that's what he thought about today's protests and the environment that we're in right now. But overall, he was very proud of young people. He loved to see young people expressing themselves and thinking. He was very proud of today's athletes for using their platforms to speak up for more social justice.
Yeah. And just a couple more questions before, and then we'll go into Q&A. I see people are dropping stuff in the chat box. So if you have a question for Jesse, feel free to do so. You personally write a lot on race and sports, and you cover a lot of powerful stories, including this entire book. What motivates you, and why do you do what you do?
When they asked me to come work for ESPN, I was working at the Associated Press, and I had been covering race, on a national level for quite some time. And I said, thanks, I love sports, I love basketball, but I would feel that I wasn't fulfilling my responsibility if all I did was write about ball games and wins and losses and pick and rolls and 3-pointers. And they said, no, The Undefeated is a new platform at ESPN to explore all the things that you write about now. So I really aspire to try to help people with my work and to try to give people a greater understanding of the way these issues are working, and also to give voice to the voiceless. There's a lot of people in this country who don't feel that they are heard and their viewpoints are marginalized or misunderstood. And so if I can help bring those to a wider audience, that's the kind of thing that motivates me in my work.
Yeah, and then Jesse, my last question, obviously, we've come a ways as a country. We still have a long way to go to achieve racial equality. I did some podcasts in light of George Floyd where I had, a bunch of my Black friends on, and we had very candid conversations. And one of the questions that I had as a white guy when we were doing those was, how can I help other than just being a good person and not being a racist? And do you have any advice for, there's a lot of white people on this call, on how we can help that cause?
I do. So a lot of people say, how'd you get into this business? And I got into this business in journalism because I had a family friend who was the advertising director at a big job at a newspaper where I grew up. And I was looking for a summer job and had no experience with journalism. He said, "Oh, you play ball, Jess, you like to read. Why don't you apply for an internship in the sports department?" And so I did well with it, but were it not for a network, a family connection, I could have missed out on my calling. And I believe that there are so many disadvantaged people in this country, economically disadvantaged. And as we know, Black people are disproportionately poor, who miss out on the opportunities of life, miss out on their true calling, miss out on a career just because they don't have that network. This is a business community that we have gathered here today. And a lot of opportunities in this country are just handed out based on who we know. Now, I grew up in the projects where we didn't know people who owned businesses, who were doctors, lawyers, newspaper advertising directors. I was fortunate enough to have that break. And here I am with you guys today because of that. And so I would encourage everybody on that call in your professional lives to know what I do is an opportunity for somebody. So to extend your network and to seek out opportunities to reach people and touch people who you might not normally encounter, who are disadvantaged racially, economically, all of the above, and to try to educate them about the opportunities that are out there and to open up the opportunities that may just go to people you know and open up those opportunities for people who you might not know, but you should. You're going to find a lot of talent there and maybe the next Jesse Washington.
Love it. Thank you for that. All right, we'll go to questions now. So Tom Sattler, I'm unaware of this. I didn't really watch the headlines this morning, but what can be done about the outrageous and unacceptable treatment of the Ohio State player on social media after the loss in the tournament? Do you want to just give some context to this and then give your take, Jesse?
Sure. So there were some racist attacks on players who lost games in the NCAA. And this is something that I've been observing and watching about and receiving for years now. Years. I mean, ever since I started writing about race in 2007, you write an article, you get racist emails. It happens all the time now. You get racist people on social media. It's people are emboldened to say those things. So what can we do about it? I think we can really support those who are on the receiving end of it. And, oh man, you're never going to stomp it out, because social media is a place where everything goes and people go there to do stuff like that. And so I think what we can do is to make sure that the people who receive it know that that doesn't represent you. And sometimes that's just a simple, for those of you who are on social media, a simple, tweet or post of support. Hey man, that's lousy. I'm sorry that happened to you. Definitely educate our children about what's appropriate to do on social media and what's not. As a father of 4, we had to go through that and the learning curve was steep, but really just show support and show that it shouldn't be tolerated.
Jamie Reeve, Captain Reeve, is wondering, what is a Hoya?
I don't know. That's a good point. I should look that up. I should look that up. I am not sure. It's a winner. I'll tell you that much. Yeah. Anybody feel free to chime in the chat with what a Hoya actually is.
A Hoya is ancient Greek for what or such, and Saxa is Latin for rocks. I don't know. Okay. Bill Coleman, Georgetown is Jesuit. Did Coach Thompson know he was going to work with the Jesuits? Oh man, I don't want to ruin the ending to the book, but the whole Jesuit and Catholic connection in the book is very powerful. Coach Thompson was a very strong Catholic. And so he definitely knew that he was going to work with the Jesuits. What he didn't know was the Jesuit role in slavery. What he didn't know, and none of us knew until a couple of years ago, was that Georgetown in 1832, number one, Georgetown owned hundreds and hundreds of slaves. And Georgetown was about to go bankrupt in 1832 and sold 272 Black human beings to ensure the survival of the school. So that's what Coach Thompson didn't know. There's more to that story. It's at the end of I Came as a Shadow, and I think it'll blow you away. It did me. Absolutely. Any more questions? There's a bunch of comments. It seems like Saj and Jamie are reminiscing on tournament memories right now, which are you guys can start your own personal chat box. Anyone else questions? Okay, we got a few more pouring in.
I'm looking up
James,
what is a Hoya.
Sharif, Ewing, Mourning, Iverson, all great Georgetown and NBA Hall of Famers. Did Coach have others lesser known whom he favored or
Yes.
relevant?
Yes. He made a point of saying that he had a lot of guys who he loved who were not the big stars. I'll just bring up one name. He's mentioned in the book, Lonnie Duran. Hardly ever played, but was so proud of the things he did. Here's a quick story for you. One of the reasons why he loved Lonnie was he said that this is early in the days before Georgetown was big. And they were playing George Washington, and a guy from George Washington cheap shotted one of the Hoyas, and a scuffle breaks out, like really gave him a dirty play and tried to hurt him. So the guy from GW kind of skirted all the way around the court to get back to his bench. And as he was walking at the end of the Georgetown bench, Lonnie Durham, bow, punched him right in the face. Coach Thompson ran over to Lonnie Duran and was gesticulating and admonishing him, but under his breath, he was saying, "That's the way you stick up for our guys, Lonnie. Good job." Lonnie Duran also had some tremendous off-the-court accomplishments, and I'm not going to give the spoiler to the book, but Coach Thompson told this story about what Lonnie Duran did, and then he concluded it by saying, "That's Georgetown basketball." Had nothing to do with putting a ball through a hoop. So a lot of players who we do not know who he loved like sons.
Love it. And I just posted the link to the book in the chat for everyone who wants to go buy it. Again, I highly recommend it. I loved reading it. And then we're going to end on this one question, which I think is a great question. Avi Lank, what rules do you think Thompson would have made for his players to deal with social media? That's a good question.
Man, I love that question.
he would have been following everyone. He would have.
Man, what rules would, don't embarrass yourself. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't embarrass Georgetown basketball. He would have said, what you post reflects on you. It reflects on this university. And to some white people, it reflects on the Black race in general. So every time you put your thumb on that phone, know that. But I think he would have adapted to the times. You know, he said that specifically. I mean, hey, I really think that Allen Iverson, who changed the whole notion of what is acceptable and what is not, and how a ball player could look and to be unapologetically himself, I think he got that sense of confidence and freedom to be himself from John Thompson. You know, even though it went against what the image of Coach Thompson had in terms of braids and tats and things like that, but it was to be authentically yourself and not to be apologetic about who you really are. And, you know, so Coach Thompson gave us Allen Iverson in that respect. So I think that when it comes to social media, he would have adjusted to the times and let the kids do what they want to do within reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Jesse, love talking to you today. That was great. Thanks for coming, and we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you so much. This is a great forum. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just so everyone knows, this will go live on my podcast next week. If you want to share it or listen back to it, I'm sure we can get that sent out.
Jesse, really appreciate you taking the time out of your day today to be with us. Fantastic conversation. Love the book. Really wish you continued success at ESPN. Look forward to future publications and books. So thank you again for being here. In honor of leaders like you who speak to our club, we will be making a donation to the YWCA Southeast Wisconsin, whose mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Thank you again so much for being here with us today. To your point earlier, Jesse, about leveraging connections, Rotarians, I encourage you all to leverage your connections to support the scholarship program, be a mentor, support the Scholarship Golf Classic, all great ways to help pay it forward. So Jesse, again, really appreciate your taking the time. Richie, you've been pretty much our de facto in-house professional talent and moderator. So again, special thank you to you also for taking the time today. Thanks for being here. We have a very exciting program next week, Tuesday. Join us to welcome 3 Rotarians. Dr. Daniel Johnson, president of Wisconsin Lutheran College, Dr. Christine Parr, president of Mount Mary University, and Dr. John Waltz, president of MSOE. They will be discussing the importance of the Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, which make up 23 institutions and serve nearly a quarter of all undergraduate students and a third of graduate students in our state. So join us next week, Tuesday, for that program. Again, really appreciate everyone taking the time to be with us today. Michelle will now be ending our program with our Rotary Now More Than Ever video series. Thank you again for being here. Our meeting is adjourned.
Rotary has a reputation for being a force for good because it's so big and it does so many things as a club. If you're thinking about Rotary, reach out to anyone you know who's in it. I'm sure they'd be happy to show you around.
If you make the point or the time in your schedule to get there, Rotary will quickly kind of get its arms around you and get you involved. So I would just encourage people who are curious or interested, attend an event, get involved and take the next step. And I think Rotary will meet you halfway and take it the rest of the way.
I've met a lot of new friends through Rotary. It's been great to meet people that you maybe are aware of, but haven't had the opportunity to sit down and break bread with, connect with new people, make good business contacts, even get some clients, as well as make a difference.
I would say it's the network. Even though we're not meeting, not able to meet face-to-face in person due to the pandemic, I still think the virtual network is a strong bond.
So it's so helpful for me to learn from other Rotarians who have had different experiences than I do, have different perspectives on the issues our region is facing, and then be able to connect and share and find overlap and how we can work together.
Like, what is your why? You know, you look at Simon Sinek talks about it a lot. You know, I think Rotary speaks to my why. It's going to make you a better person. You're going to be better for helping the community out.